He wrote a ton of tangos, but he was more than just a one-trick pony. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Astor Piazzolla. Piazzolla was born in March 1921 in Argentina, in the city of Mar del Plata on the Atlantic Ocean. He doesn't have a super South American-sounding name, and for good reason. Both of his parents were from Italian immigrant families. Between 1821 and 1932, Argentina actually took in the second most immigrants of any country in the world, behind only the United States. It's likely that Piazzolla never actually remembered much, if at all, from his very earliest years in Argentina. It wasn't long after he was born that the family uprooted and moved to New York City, settling in Greenwich Village, which at that point was not the kind of gentrified place it is now. Oh, no sir, quite the opposite. Astor had to learn how to survive on his own, and he became rather independent. He listened to his dad's idiosyncratic record collection, from traditional Argentinian tangos to pieces from the established Western canon. He went to Duke Ellington performances in Harlem, and he also heard a lot of Jewish wedding music because he put out candles in synagogues on the Sabbath for some extra money. When he was 8, his dad bought him a bandoneon, which is a kind of free-reed instrument similar to the accordion and popular in traditional Argentinian tango music. The difference between the accordion and the bandoneon is that the accordion has a keyboard and a set of buttons, whereas the bandoneon only has buttons, which apparently intimidated the young Astor when he first saw it. As it happened, the Piazzolla's neighbor was actually the Hungarian pianist Bela Vilda, who was a student of Sergei Rachmaninoff, and he taught the young Piazzolla to play Bach on his new instrument. Soon enough, the family found themselves in Little Italy, and Astor became very good at just shredding on his cheap pawn-shop bandoneon. He was so good that when he was 13, he caught the attention of Carlos Gardel, who was kind of the man at that point when it came to the Argentinian tango as a genre. And he invited Piazzolla to join his group, his world-famous, world-touring orchestra. But his dad said no. He said that his son was still too young to be doing something like that. And while Piazzolla was very depressed at first about not having this chance, he thought it was going to be his one chance to make it big in the tango world. But as it turned out, not too long after that, Gardel and his orchestra perished in a plane crash just outside of the Colombian city of Medellin. But the point is that Piazzolla was stuck on music. He was so hooked on it, he couldn't even think about studying anything else. Later in his teen years, the Piazzollas would move back to Mar del Plata, where Astor was caught up in the tango orchestras and the music and culture that surrounded the dance. Eventually he ended up on his own in Buenos Aires, first as a replacement bandoneonist in several orchestras, and then he was hired full-time because he was good. Yet he still wanted to know more about the wider world of music than just the tango in performance and in arrangement. So he tracked down Arthur Rubinstein and showed him one of his amateurish pieces. Rubinstein was kind to the kid and sent him up with Alberto Ginastera, who would go on to become one of the preeminent Argentinian composers of all time. Piazzolla would go on to become Ginastera's first real composition pupil. For 6 years, Piazzolla would wake up early and go to bed late, as he crammed in study of the classics alongside his tango orchestra gigs, which would almost inevitably run into the wee hours of the morning. As he learned more and more, the established band leaders thought Piazzolla was too powerful. They almost inevitably had to rearrange his arrangements because he was inevitably trying to sneak in something that was too avant-garde for their tastes. He would never find an established tango orchestra that would do everything that he wanted to do. So what do you do in that point? Well, you start your own. He actually founded his own orchestra in 1946. He led it for 4 years, and during that period began experimenting and twisting and turning the tango into something new. But by 1950, he was just burned out. He disbanded the orchestra in part because he felt like he needed to find his own voice, and he was having a crisis. Was his own voice going to be found in the strict confines of the tango? He didn't think it would. At the end of the day, he couldn't study what he wanted to study of the classics and also keep up with the demands of running his own tango orchestra. Even in his non-tango music, he still keeps to the sound world of the tango. For instance, he wrote a symphony which included a couple of bandoneon parts, which wasn't a widely popular move, but the French liked it, and they gave him a grant to come over to Paris and study with basically the preeminent music professor in the world, Mademoiselle Nadia Boulanger. At first, of course, he wanted to play anything for her that wasn't a tango because he was so afraid of being the tango guy. It's not like they were bad pieces by any stretch of the imagination. They were competent pieces, but Boulanger never found anything within those pieces that was unique to Piazzolla. She just heard poor imitations of other composers, which is generally what she had criticisms of when anyone showed her something that she didn't quite like. She was always after finding the unique voice of a given composer, and she wanted to push and stretch the limits of her pupils until they found what was unique to them. And eventually, after she prodded him and kept asking him questions about his musical background, he finally broke down and told her of his background playing tangos, and she said, well, you should play one for me. It was only after she convinced him that the tango was a legitimate genre, and that Stravinsky himself loved the sound of the bandoneon, that he decided that he would play her one of his best tangos. And it wasn't but one phrase into this piece that Boulanger stopped him and said, "This is Piazzolla," and she encouraged him to embrace what made him him. And what made him him was the tango. He knew the form inside and out, and Boulanger finally convinced him that he didn't need to avoid what made him unique as a composer in order to just fit what he thought was the Western mold. His year-and-a-half-long study with Boulanger would be on the elements of the classical tradition which she knew best, and which he wanted to learn in order to incorporate them into his future tangos. Now back in his homeland, Piazzolla was, as they say, en fuego. He took the tango, broke it, melted it down, and recast it in his image, and he went nuts with including different kinds of spins on what the tango meant, the very essence of the genre. He included unique instrumentations. He wasn't afraid of including a saxophone or an electric guitar, or occasionally overhauling the structure. He even tried to fuse jazz into it, even though he would later say that that was probably a mistake, but I mean, you have to go beyond the limits in order to know where those limits are. His first electric guitarist, Horatio Malvicino, actually received threats on his life. So new was what he was trying to do to the established world of the tango. There were some people who really didn't like it. Nothing was off limits to Piazzolla so long as the tango was still eminently recognizable as a tango, and it was, but to non-Argentinians. The Argentinians themselves, some of them, not all of them, were too steeped in the tradition of the music and the dance as it had been established, that any variation from that tradition was seen as heretical. And so while he became more popular outside Argentina, it took a while for the Argentinians to embrace Piazzolla as someone writing great Argentinian music. The reason they didn't like it is quite simple. A lot of his more experimental tangos were tangos that were shorn from the dance. Throughout music history, as dance forms reach their maturity, they become less and less danceable. A Chopin waltz, or the 5/4 waltz from Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, these are not waltzes that you can waltz to. You can't dance to these pieces. The music takes the name of the dance form and some of its tendencies and structures, but doesn't feel the need to be in the right tempo or the right structure for dancing. Like those waltzes I mentioned, a lot of Piazzolla's tangos are tangos that are meant for concert use, not necessarily to dance to. Although you can dance to anything if you believe in yourself. Put simply, places in the world where the tango wasn't an inherent and inextricable part of the culture loved what Piazzolla did to it. But for the Argentinians, it just took a little while for them to adapt. At this point, they thought he was just too avant-garde, but in a twist of irony, the constant media critiques of him actually made him more popular. Piazzolla is not tango, they would say. The fringe who thought he was outright unpatriotic in writing this music was fringe enough to make threats on him and on his bandmates' lives. If you clung for dear life to the traditional tango, you probably weren't a fan of Piazzolla in this era. But other people really liked him. It was still a slow rise towards success, even if he was beginning to hit upon the form that would become known as Tango Nuevo. New Tango. He formed groups and played with them, toured around, cut recordings, appeared on television specials, a whole bunch of things. He always worked hard, and this came back to bite him because he suffered his first heart attack when he was just in his 50s. This forced him to slow down for a time and settle in Italy, where he worked on recording many of his pieces, most notably the Libertango, which is one of his more famous pieces that's been reworked so much that, true story, I was once asked to MC a recital where the first piece on this program was a flute and guitar rendition that was a mashup of Piazzolla's Libertango with Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit, and it actually worked. His international travels proved a blessing in disguise, as he was more or less able to avoid the 8-year military dictatorship of Jorge Rafael Fitela, although he was once roped into lunch with the guy, but that was because, at that point, he was known for writing very Argentinian music. He was considered very patriotic, and he portrayed Argentina in a good light on the international stage. At that point in his career, nobody in the government had a problem with him. If it had been significantly earlier, a lunch with the president might have ended very poorly. Recounting much of his career at this point would merely take the form of a listing of ensembles he appeared with and concerts in which he performed and honors won, and the nearly 50 films he scored and the over 70 albums he recorded. I mean, the man was just so prolific that it's hard to know where to start. So let's take a look at some of his more enduring pieces. I've already mentioned the Libertango, but another of his tangos to get endlessly reworked and remixed and rearranged is Oblivion. This was a short tango written in 1982 for a film called Henry IV, which is based on a play about a guy who's crazy and thinks that he's the Holy Roman Emperor. Just go with it. The tango doesn't really push the boundaries by Piazzolla's standards, but it's so exceedingly beautiful that it works no matter what instruments it's played on, and I've heard a ton of different versions of this. The first time I heard it was actually a version for string ensemble, and so for some reason I kind of associate it as being his version of, like, the Adagio for strings. Maybe that's just me. Tango is sad and dramatic, Piazzolla said, but it's not pessimistic. Another of his greatest and most enduring tangos is Le Grand Tango for cello and piano, written for the Russian virtuoso Mstislav Rostropovich. This is a real masterpiece that takes the listener on a 12-minute tango journey that also shows off the idiomatic capabilities of both cello and piano. We so often hear Piazzolla pieces transcribed and rearranged that it's a real joy to listen to a piece in its original incarnation. Even though it contains these moments where the tango rhythm bursts through the texture and moments of exuberance, you realize that in any other composer's hands this would sound trite or cliché or out of nowhere or funny. And it doesn't sound like that at all. He handles it in such a masterful way that he can go from moments of super intense, super sexy tango music all the way to some kind of Chopin-esque ornamental filigree, and it works. Hats off. Not to be outdone, Histoire du Tango is one of his most widely played pieces. At least it's the piece I've heard the most live. It attempts to recount the entire history of the tango. The 4 movements capture the tango in the years 1900, 1930, 1960, and its publication year, 1986. At this point in his career, he was such a well-known figure and the world's leading composer of tango music that he was able to write what he wanted to write. He didn't have to worry about things just becoming grist for the performing mill. Le Grand Tango, for instance, wouldn't receive its premiere by its dedicatee until 1990, but this didn't bother Piazzolla one bit. He called himself a supermarket of music. He also enjoyed, in his downtime, shark fishing. For those of you keeping score at home, that's fishing for sharks. To be fair, they hadn't invented Shark Week yet, but if they had, you could rest assured that he'd be on it. But by the end of the 1980s, his health was beginning a serious decline, and he had to undergo a quadruple bypass surgery. 2 years later, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage on his way to the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. For the next 2 years, he was in a coma, and he finally passed away in July of 1992. Piazzolla is rightfully celebrated for his reimagining of what the tango was and meant. He could have been a decent composer in the traditional tango form, or he could have chosen to include some occasional Argentinian timbres in a more rarefied classical tradition, but instead he decided to merge the two and create his own path. Of all the things he studied with Mademoiselle Boulanger, Counterpoint proved the most important, as he used it as a tool to help balance out the soloists in his group. Experimentation was not out of the question either, so long as it fit with what he was trying to go after. You can find the occasional 12-tone passage in some of his pieces, although this is rather rare. While he led many different ensembles over the years, and his music, as established, has been arranged for pretty much everything you could possibly name, his preferred setup was himself on the bandoneon with a violin, a piano, an electric guitar, and a double bass. Not too large, not too small. The Goldilocks of Tango Nuevo ensembles. The traditional tango, Piazzolla said, no longer existed. Tango Nuevo was present-day tango. The reforms he injected into the style were something he saw as a necessity, something that resurrected the form from just becoming a relic of the past. He did this because he didn't like the stagnancy of the tango. He saw it as old, boring, always the same, and repeated. His reforms even extended to playing technique, as he was the first bandoneonist to actually play the thing standing up. In all, he wrote over 750 pieces, and yet many people believe that it's not truly Piazzolla if you hear other people play it. You have to hear the man himself in the recordings that he made. So attuned was he to the eternal heartbeat of the tango that he so loved.